simplistic, I find the tourism scene here really offensive in a lot of ways. It preaches walls, pandas, and dragons, and it's a crime for me when there's really beautiful, interesting, moving art occurring and it's not being promoted because it doesn't fit sort of the propaganda model of these large travel companies, how they want to frame.
Well, it's also the government itself. You know, during the Olympics, they closed down all the clubs because they figured they wanted to show their best face to the West, and they figured underground music clubs was something that they didn't want to show to the West, which is ironic because it's quite the opposite. This is what the West would love to see. But they do that a lot, and we're very lucky because we're under the radar still. And once we're no longer under the radar, I think, you know, hip hop has really exploded in China, and now the government's really coming down hard on it. And so there's always, you know, we always worry about that here. We don't want to be too visible.
Isn't that like jujitsu a little bit, where if you come down too hard in hip hop, they just go, yeah, that's our thing. People coming down on us.
Yes and no. I think that's a foreign thing. You know, foreigners and a lot of middle-class Chinese, they have all of these stereotypes about what they expect in China. I was on a BBC panel a while back, and they were all going on and on about how, you know, China how disappointed they are that China isn't producing any great culture. And it pissed me off because people come here and first of all they say, oh, you've got a dictatorship, so therefore your artists must be angry punks, you know, shaking their fists at the government. That's bullshit. You do that in the West because you sell more CDs. You do that here, you go to jail. And it's, so they expect that, or else they expect the Chinese to be properly authentic. So there was a punk band called the Hangai.
Is this the Mongolian?
Yeah, yes, they were a punk band.
I love that.
Yeah,
that's a great video of them.
One of them has spent a few years in Mongolia. The rest of them are all Beijingers. And they realized that playing ethnic music, Mongolian music, and most of them have never seen a horse in their lives, but they play Mongolian music and they're hugely popular. People want to come to China and see that. They want to see you play the erhu. Now, the fact that these kids have grown up in some of the biggest cities in the world and they spend more of their time on computers than Western kids do, and you know, they deal with subways and traffic jams and high school teachers and shit like that. You know, they're just like kids in Cleveland in a sense. But we don't, if you're American or if you're European, you're given total freedom to explore whatever you want. I spent most of my life growing up in developing countries, and it's not just a China problem, but it's particularly a problem in China because you're expected to be Chinesey. That is, you're expected to fill whatever the correct stereotypes are. So you can get total crap, and if it's on an erhu, you'll get all of these, particularly very nice Europeans will say, oh yeah, this is the real China. Bullshit, the real China doesn't play erhu. The real China plays probably synthesizer or electric guitar. And we're starting to break out of that. In the beginning, the Chinese musicians, it used to piss them off a lot. I remember when Young Hai Song was touring Germany, he kept saying, look, we're not a Chinese rock and roll band, we're a rock and roll band, and we're from China. And it's very, very, if you're American or European, you can do that. If you're Chinese, or from most developing countries, it's very hard to do that because people never let you forget that you're Chinese and you're supposed to conform to whatever it is that Chinese people do. And we all know what Chinese culture is. We don't, but we think we do. And it's very important that the Chinese, if a kid from Beijing plays Mongolian music or Yunnan music, then, you know, then he's properly Chinese. If he plays electric guitar, all of a sudden it's like, oh no, he's just copying the West. But a kid growing up in Beijing is not going to play Yunnan music or Mongolian music. A kid growing up in Beijing is a city boy, and he's going to play loud, obnoxious music. So I think among artists, you know, in New York and in Europe, we don't have that problem so much. I mean, the artists in New York in particular, when Shoan goes there, he's a star. They take him really seriously for his music. But among audiences, it's still a problem. People come here expecting to see something recognizably Chinese. And the only thing you can say about Chinese youth culture is that what's happened in China in the last 20 years is really unprecedented. It's never happened in history before for any country. 20 years ago, China was 75% rural and village. Today, it's more than 50, 60% urban. And most of these kids have, you know, they've grown up in enormous cities in they are, in terms of internet connections and living on their mobile phones, they're probably further ahead than anybody else in the world. So this idea that they're going to produce a culture that's recognizable to us is sort of bizarre. It's very unlikely that whatever they produce is something that we're going to recognize. And it's certainly not going to fit in whatever stereotypes we have of Chinese authenticity and Chinese culture. And that's one of the things that we continue to fight. It's a problem. People come here wanting to see something that's nice and Chinesey. And the artists, they don't want to be Chinesey. They don't really care what you think of them. They just want to be taken, this is what they do, and either it's good or it's bad. We'll get there eventually, but it's still a big struggle. The Japanese went through that in the 60s and 70s. Now we allow the Japanese to be modern, but 30, 40 years ago, they had to play they wear their damn costumes and play their damn traditional instruments.
又是个无聊早晨，周围荒无人烟。过往吃过早餐，走到窗前，外面没有下雨，但是看不见山，树影充满原野。
And then as a follow-up to that, do you sort of believe there needs to be a creative destruction of the traditional, or that cultures can remain trapped if they are not given sort of room to grow out of the traditional?
Well, it almost doesn't matter what we think should happen, because we know what did happen. During the Cultural Revolution, there was a wholesale destruction of culture, and they went out of their way to destroy particularly vestiges of traditional Chinese culture. If you go to the Summer Palace, for example, you'll see a lot of destruction there, and you'll see signs everywhere. This is what the British soldiers did. This is what the French soldiers did after the Boxer Rebellion. But then there's a lot of destruction with no signs. And when you ask about it, it was, that took place in the 1960s. I mean, they literally went there and smashed all the statues. So there was this massive destruction of culture and this deracination that took place in the 60s and 70s. And that stopped in the 80s, but then beginning in the 80s, you had the so-called reform and opening up period, in which China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to a solidly middle-income country in a very short period of time. Chinese per capita income is probably quadrupled in a little over a generation, which is pretty astonishing. And more importantly was the huge moves within the country. China was predominantly a village society, a rural society, until quite recently. Now it's a predominantly urban society. And there may be cases, maybe South Korea in the 60s, or Japan after the war, of such rapid sort of urbanization, but they're pretty rare. The urbanization that China went through, I think few countries have ever urbanized as quickly, and certainly no one on such a massive scale. I mean, migration within China you measure in the hundreds of millions. So as a result, whatever has come out of this is quite new. It's something that we don't really know a lot about. We don't have many historical precedents for it. We don't really know, what typically does a country do after going through the experiences of China, because no one's gone through the experiences of China. This is all quite new. And it's not just the reform and opening up. It's the reform and opening up that followed the Cultural Revolution period. So what's going to come out of this is going to be very different and very new. Young Chinese, particularly young Chinese, they sort of developed, in the US we had the big generation gap in the 60s. The generation gap here is even deeper because the parents grew up in the Cultural Revolution and the kids grew up in a completely different China, much more optimistic, rapidly growing China, but also a China without any sort of signs, without any indication. So much social and cultural change took place, and the only signposts were, these sort of really garish style magazines imitating the West. Those were the only signposts they had, and out of that they had to sort of create a culture, and it's still in the process of being created. You can see it. You can really feel the changes taking place. The way fads just whip through young people. Hip hop just really exploded in 3 or 4 years. Everyone is doing it now. The double one holidays, which is November 11th, which was a holiday started as a joke in the 1990s at Nanjing University, where there's so much pressure to get married immediately. You really don't have a social life until you get married. That's how it used to be. And so these kids in Nanjing University started this sort of jokey holiday, like we're single and we're not so bad. And that's become the biggest shopping holiday in the world. I mean, it just dwarfs the day after Thanksgiving and the day after Christmas in the US. And that just started 20 years ago, not even. So you see all of this happening in China, and it's really hard to predict where it's going to go, because again, we have no historical precedents to guide us. But I think it's very, very clear that whatever happens in China, it's going to be something unexpected, something that's going to catch us by surprise, and it should be something really interesting. I mean, 1/5 of the world are Chinese, so I mean, I'm sure we can cough up 1/5 of the world's artists too, and they're going to do something. The thing is, we have to learn to define Chinese culture correctly, and that is, Chinese culture is whatever Chinese artists say it is. And that's the best definition we can come up with. But of course, we don't do that. We all have very clear ideas of what Chinese culture is supposed to be. It's supposed to be angry punks shaking their fists at the government, or it's supposed to be a village culture, or it's supposed to be a Mongolian culture. Mongolian culture, Yunnanese culture, and the Xinjiang culture are the ones that we like the best. And never mind that Xinjiang is further away from China than from Beijing than Australia, it seems. If you do Xinjiang culture in Beijing, you're immediately accepted, and people say, okay, now you're really expressing, the Chinese soul, which is total bullshit. It's not. It's like a Jewish kid from New York putting on a cowboy hat and cowboy boots and twanging on a guitar. I mean, that's fine, but that's not what New York artists do, and we don't go to New York expecting them to do that. But we come to China expecting them to do the equivalent.
Artistic drive. What are some of the signposts you're seeing created from some of the music that is coming out of maybe Mars?
Yeah, I wouldn't really know how to define the signposts, but what we've really done is what we find artists that we really like, that we think are worth supporting, and then we just support them, whatever they do. And we've been really lucky because, if anyone puts together a list. been great stuff coming out, but it's very varied. Now, what I do notice is that, like artists everywhere, they have their influences and they have their foreign influences, and there are certain periods that are really important here. So New York in the 70s and early 80s, that's a really important period for a lot of Beijing artists, and you know, that's when I was in New York. New York was going through enormous change. Those were the days when everyone knew for a fact that New York's days were numbered. It was, you know, it was dying, you know. I mean, it really felt like that. Everyone was saying New York is finished, it's over. And that turned out to be one of the most exciting times in history to be in New York. But it's a period that a lot of Chinese turn to. They also turned a lot to the early 80s in England, the whole Manchester scene, which was also a time of tremendous change and despair and anger and confusion. And so I think those are, you know, maybe it's not a coincidence that those are the periods that they particularly like. But I think it speaks reasonably well to them. You have to remember the generation gap here is incredibly deep. It really is deeper than the generation gap in the 1960s. I've been teaching at one or the other of the top 2 universities in China for the last 16 years. And you know, you speak to the kids and they have no connection with their parents. They just don't understand each other. They spend most of their lives trying to hide their lives from their parents because it's just so unacceptable. And somehow they have to deal with all of this and come up with something, with some form of culture. And they are. It's just really hard to define. Music has been the front line. But you're seeing it in other areas. You're seeing it in fashion. You're seeing it in movies to a lesser extent. Movies has been more formalized. You see it in the art, although the art scene, it very, very quickly became what here we refer to as Jijiuba, the 798 scene. 798 are these old empty factories that are in the Northwest. And the joke there was that it went from Soho 1970 to Soho 1990 in 6 months, and it really did. There were all these beautiful empty Bauhaus factories which some artists moved into and just started doing stuff, and then there's so much money floating around that everybody was looking for the art scene, and they found that, and an article came out in the New York Times, and within 6 months it was easier to buy, you know, a $5,000 dress there than to meet an artist. And that's been really dominating the art scene, that commercial art. And I think a lot of the young artists that we're interested in and that we work with are very frustrated with that scene. They don't want to have anything to do with it because there is this perception that, you know, if you're not selling canvases for $50,000 a pop by the time you're 30, then you're a failure. And obviously that's a description or a definition of art that a lot of young artists are just very unhappy about. But the art it became very strong because it was just flooded with money. It became very, very profitable. And so we're starting to see art move around that. China's developing a really interesting comic scene, influenced a lot by the Japanese comic scene. So it's stuff like that. A lot of artists are doing stuff that's not very easy to, you know, to get hold of and to sell. And I think part of it is they're just very unhappy with the way money just overwhelmed the art scene here. There is so much interest in Chinese art that you have a reasonable shot of, you know, pumping out canvases at $50,000 a pop. There are going to be people who are going to pump out canvases. They're going to figure out what is it that the collectors want, and that's what I want to give them. But, you know, like in any place, art's very commercial in the US and in Europe too. Sure. But there are lots of people who are just, there are people who use that and can exploit it, and there's a lot of people who can't really use it and exploit it, but still are doing art. And, you know, that's what we're seeing.